Hello and welcome to Agency Office Hours for March 2025. I'm Karl Sakas, Agency Advisor. Our focus today is a fireside chat around selling your agency. Specifically, we're looking at why your agency exit starts now, whether you realize it or not. And we have special guest Jonathan Baker from Punctuation answering questions. We have questions that people have submitted beforehand. I've identified some questions. If you're joining us live and want to ask some questions, please share them in chat. Don't share anything out loud or that you don't want others to hear about since we are recording. And if you're joining us live, you'll get the video within 24 hours. And if you're watching the video already, well, you have this immediately. Please like or subscribe or both. There we go. All right. Well, Jonathan, thank you so much for joining as our guest expert today. You were one of our guest experts at the Control and Maximize Your Agency Exit workshop, which is now available as an on-demand training. If people aren't familiar with you, if you could, please introduce yourself.
Yes, Jonathan Baker. I'm one half of the firm Punctuation. The other half is my father, David C. Baker. We are a small boutique consultancy for small to mid-sized independent marketing firms. We have kind of an advisory practice where we help with positioning, lead generation, benchmarking, that type of thing, and then an M&A practice, which I head up, where we do valuations and then sell side searches, buy side searches, internal transfers, basically helping agency owners and founders figure out what's next.
Awesome. And I have been referring people to Punctuation for over a decade. So if you're not familiar with them or you haven't checked them out, please visit at punctuation.com. All right, first question. This is about exit planning. What is the biggest misconception agency owners have about when to start exit planning?
I mean, this feels like a layup, Carl. So thank you. Um, it's that you shouldn't really think about it until you're close to it. But there's a lot of things that you need to be thinking about earlier. Not just, things like the positioning of your firm or what you as a founder, what role you're taking on, but even more practical things like are your books clean and are you using the right accounting practices?
So like the agency I worked with years ago where they were leasing a BMW for one of the owners for 900 a month at the time,
Yeah.
that wondering how they would justify that. That might be something to clean up.
Yeah, and an example like that is actually great because that doesn't mean you need to stop doing it. That just means that you need to first make sure that you're um, cataloging expenses in a way that's easy to, you know, justify later so you can show your receipts and also adjust your own expectations about what that means for your valuation. And frankly, it likely would increase the value of your firm if you're taking that out of expenses.
But maybe don't sign a new lease that will extend beyond when you're hoping to sell.
Unless you plan on paying for it personally. Yeah.
Th- There, there we go. Uh, so now, question about the selling process. What are the key factors that determine how long it will take to sell an agency?
Yeah, that it's a tricky one. I would say because every deal is different and the key factors can be so deal dependent. So the biggest key factor is really who the buyer is.
Mm,
Um, you have buyers that move slower than others. A
right.
lot of it is dependent on where the funding is coming from. So it's the same, if you're paying cash for a house, you can close a lot faster than if you are using a bank loan, in which case you have to, get the appraisal and get it inspected. And like there's just things that you have to do that the bank loan is contingent upon. And the same is true for selling a business. But
Mm.
even beyond that, different buyers have different risk tolerances and so do different levels of due diligence. So I would say the larger your firm is, the riskier it is generally, right? to purchase, like you're going to be putting more money up front. And so the more due diligence you should expect to be done. But that's not always the case. We're running a buy side search right now um, for a group of buyers, and they're committing to a 30-day close for a
Mm.
$11 million firm, like not a small firm.
That's a
So
very Warren Buffett approach, right?
yeah,
We'll review it and we're going to close fast.
yeah, yeah. So the buyer is one of the key factors. I think the other factor is really the economic environment in which you are selling in. So
Mm.
right now, for example, I mean, we're still seeing a lot more buyers than we are sellers, which is something I mentioned likely when we talked earlier.
Mhm.
That's still the case, and we're seeing that shrink timelines because buyers know that they have to pounce a little quicker on deals that they might be interested in, so they're getting to the point of due diligence, signing an LOI faster than they might normally. There is kind of a minimum timeline. I would say 5 to 6 months. I would not expect anything to get done under 5 to 6 months if you're doing a search. Now, that could be
Mhm.
compressed if you already have a buyer in hand.
Got
Um, and then normal would be closer to 8 to 9 months. But in this environment, we've seen that, closer to 6 to 7 months. So,
got it. So, if someone comes to you saying, I want to sell tomorrow, and they don't have a buyer already identified, you're going to have to manage their expectations.
yes.
Makes sense. Uh, when it comes to valuation and increasing valuation, we talked about this in session 3 of the Control and Maximize Your Agency exit training. What are some things that agency owners can do to increase their future valuation?
Um, First, have a strong positioning. The stronger your positioning, the more or the harder it is to replicate what you do. And so the more money or the higher the multiple you're going to be able to command. Second, make sure that you have a balanced client portfolio, um, and move as much of that to something resembling recurring revenue as possible. That obviously is not always possible. Like if you're a brand house, then no one's going to expect you to have recurring revenue. But
Right.
if that's something that's feasible, that certainly helps with valuations. Consistent profitability. People want to see stability. So, what they're looking for when they're valuing your company is the predictability of future revenue and profits, right? And if you can show consistent profitability in the past, that will help increase your valuation. Um, the reliance on the founder.
Mhm.
It's okay to be involved in the business, but you don't want to be involved in every aspect of the business. You don't want, all the work to go through you. Business development and sales is really where most buyers expect the principal's time to be spent. Um, Make sure you have strong processes in place, which kind of goes along with making sure that you're not founder reliant. And then a strong leadership team that is willing to stay on board also helps.
And
Um,
and ideally, perhaps with some degree of incentives to keep the team so they don't just quit if you want them to stay.
yes. And you won't have to do that for everyone on your team, but if there's one or two key people, keep that in mind, and that will likely have to come out of your cut.
I usually see owners do, whether it's phantom stock or something like that, where maybe they have a number two who's running the day to day. They're going to get something like 10% of the proceeds to, to get to the exit and to stick around. It's all negotiable, of course.
Yep.
Makes sense. A follow-up question. You mentioned that buyers are looking for stability in profits. What if an agency has had a bad year? Kind of what are some ways to, I guess you can't get around that completely, but what are some ways to deal with that?
Yeah, if you've got a single bad year, that's not really a concern as long as you have a story around it, and a plan to move out of it. So one blip isn't going to hurt your story that much. I think most buyers understand that things happen. Maybe you're working, with the tech industry, and the tech industry had a bad year, and so
Yep.
that obviously affected you. But what they want to see is that you can rebound from that, that you've got a plan to recover. Um, so, that's part of what you do with an M&A advisor, is make sure that you're crafting a story that makes sense. And I would say, in general, you don't want to shy away or try to hide any of this stuff, because if it looks
Right.
like you're trying to hide a bad year, that's going to raise all kinds of yellow flags for buyers, and they're going to think you're trying to hide other stuff.
It's like, yeah, what else is it kind of thing.
Yeah,
That,
it's
that
better
makes
to just
sense.
face it head on. Yeah,
There we go. Uh, Here's a question from Nick. Speaking of industry focus, this is about multiple niches or multiple specializations. What are the pros and cons of specializing in two very distinct industries? And I have some additional details. I can share those if that would be helpful, Jonathan.
please.
So, Nick shared, we recognize the importance of niching down and developing expertise in a narrow vertical for positioning, efficiency, branding, differentiation, etc., the various benefits, and that is a key to their future growth. However, they have two verticals where the agency has very strong experience, and they both appear to be attractive niching targets. I'm not going to mention the two exact examples out loud so people could, just copy it, but one is SaaS related and the other is professional services related, but in different industries. So he notes we're exploring both of those simultaneously, but the question is that wise? Is that going to get in the way of both pursuing the niches and also is that going to create a challenge for future exit, or would they need to choose one or the other?
Yeah, so I'll approach this from an exit standpoint, not necessarily a is this wise for my business standpoint.
Yeah.
But philosophically, what you're trying to do when you're selling your business is to have as many options to sell to as possible, which then drives the price up, right? Um, Niching has many benefits, and Nick mentioned a lot of them in his in the framing of the question, right? And it does help you with selling as well, in that you can command a higher multiple because you've got a more strategic buyer that's going to be interested in you. However, you're not always going to be able to find strategic buyers. Those are they're not unicorns. They're less rare than that, but that's not you're not always going to be able to sell to a strategic. You will always be able to sell to a financial buyer. And when I say financial buyer, that means someone who's really valuing you primarily based on your finances alone. And frankly, that's how most deals are done. Even the strategic purchases, they just might kind of increase the multiple or something. But because that's the case, I would say having two focuses isn't going to hurt your value. Just make sure that they are profitable focuses. So if you have to choose between profitability and industry focus, always choose profitability, because you're always going to be able to sell to a financial buyer. You won't always be able to sell to a strategic buyer.
That makes sense. And to add on, in my work, I'm often helping agencies that are looking to grow toward an exit. And once they're in the final stage, then I'll point them over to an M&A advisor. When it comes to looking at this on more of an operations and day-to-day strategy perspective, there is that risk of diluting your effort where you're trying to pursue two different things at once. If you think about how are you going to market to those niches, some of it includes content on your site. So if you have a blog, is your blog going to cover both industries at once? Or are you going to have two different blogs effectively, or some sort of filtering so that if someone is in one industry, they don't get your website and they're like, huh, they're talking about this other stuff. Is this for me? Right. So thinking in terms of the buyer experience, are they going to see you as a specialist in their area? How will you make
Yeah.
that happen? You also could look at, are you going to events, conferences, things like that in a particular industry? Do you have the bandwidth to go to events in both industries and to get known in both industries? And if you're a founder-led salesperson, or doing founder-led sales as the agency founder, what's your LinkedIn headline going to say? Are you an expert in when I used to do positioning, now I just point people to punctuation for positioning. But when I used to, people would share an example of like, I want to know what's the most lucrative industry I could specialize in. And the example more than one person said was funeral services. I don't know why, but that seems to be the example. But consider like, are you going to say on your LinkedIn headline, I am the world's leading expert on funeral services and B2B SaaS? Probably not. So consider how people are going to perceive it. Jonathan, anything you'd add before we move on to the next question?
Yeah, I will say the larger you get, the more important it would also be to keep those P&Ls separate,
Hmm.
or at least be able to separate them, because you might get to a point where it actually you'll be able to maximize your exit by spinning one out separately. And you also might find that you enjoy one more than the other. Um, and when you're talking about a strategic purchaser, you're not going to find a strategic purchaser that wants to buy both healthcare and financial at the same time, right? You'll find one or the other. And so, because those strategics are finding you more often than you're finding them, being able to peel off that piece of the agency could benefit you when it comes time to sell.
Awesome. That actually is a great segue into our next question, a question from Sarah. Uh, the question is this: if my agency has multiple unrelated divisions, do I need to break them up to sell them separately? And let me elaborate on the question to help with answering that. So my agency is not like other agencies. Two-thirds is traditional in terms of web development, digital marketing. The other third is a tourism publishing business. I'm not going to mention the exact websites out loud, but again, imagine like local tourism publishing sites for a particular region, uh, and driven primarily through advertising sales for the websites. So the question is, do we have to break up our companies to sell them? And if so, that would go from an agency of one size to a smaller agency, and then the advertising-based publishing business. So you had mentioned earlier keeping things on separate P&Ls, but what's your reaction to that from around that question?
Yeah, I mean, in that situation, I'd imagine there are already relatively separate P&Ls. But I would say no, you don't necessarily need to break up the business for two reasons. One, financially, you get higher multiples the more profit you can demonstrate. And so combining those two pieces of profit, you've got a higher likelihood of getting a higher multiple. And a financial buyer isn't going to necessarily care where that profit's coming from. And two, uh, you might find someone that values both aspects. I mean, yes, they might sound unrelated, but they're not, right? Like they do play off of each other, and there's surely some learnings from one side that translate to the other and vice versa. Um, and so I would say it's always worth going through the search with them together, knowing that you might have to go through the search again and break them off, or you might find a buyer, a particular buyer that's only interested in part of it. But that's a hill you can climb when you get to it. You don't need to, plan in advance for selling them off separately. I would, in your case, certainly try as one first.
Makes sense. We just got a follow-up question from Sarah. Is there such thing as selling without the owner staying on? I know we've talked a bit about this. Jonathan,
Yeah,
what's your answer on that?
there is. Um, What that does is narrows your pool of buyers pretty considerably, which philosophically will lower uh, your sale price. Um, what would be a better compromise would be being willing to stay on in like a consultative role for a certain period of time, um, a certain number of hours per week, or yeah, it really depends on how detached you are from running the business now anyway. But I mean, we sold a business last year where it was a 1 month uh, period where the seller was committing to stay on, and after that, they were out. Just know that your multiple might take a little bit of a hit. But again, it's a little bit buyer dependent, and some buyers are going to want to come in and they have an operator already, and so they're fine with you getting out of the way. But most are going to want to keep someone around running the business for stability's sake for a little while.
Makes sense. And I mean, I have clients where the owner has made themselves increasingly optional. I've helped them with succession planning. They have a team member who's running things. So there, the owner may be working like 1.5 days a week. That's going to be a lot easier to go to a consultative role than if they are, for instance, the primary salesperson, the primary
Yeah,
thought leader, things like that.
right.
That makes
Right. So
sense.
the extent you can prove you're already detached from the business, that's going to help you in those negotiations.
Makes sense. And one more follow-up question from Sarah, raising a good point. Why would you do that? Why would you do the consultative role with your own agency when you could earn more over time with limited investment?
Yeah.
Or-
So,
yeah,
I mean, it's a great question. And there are scenarios in which, excuse me,
Zinte.
in which it would not make sense to sell in that case. But I would say from our experience, an absentee owner over time, that agency is going to slowly wane. And what you're doing is just kind of leaving money on the table by just bleeding slowly. When you're selling, you're getting a multiple on hopefully a bigger number. And so, 4 to 6 years worth of those earnings. And it's hard to, for most, unless you're just insanely profitable, it's hard to keep that level up if you're continually stepping back. And one aspect, which often doesn't get discussed, is really just like your own mental state. Like, think
Yep.
about having the mental drain of being the point person in the business, the buck stops with you, not having the big bank account to do the things you want to do with the rest of your life, knowing that you just have to reserve some energy for this thing. And for some people that might not be a big deal, for some it might be it, but it's something to consider.
Awesome. We have a question from Jason about exit strategy, which is what are some practical steps that you can take now to sell later? That actually segues into a word from our sponsor, me. What can you do to prepare right now for a future exit if you're not looking to do it immediately? I would recommend getting my exit plan template. So as we've discussed, it helps to start planning early, sooner than later for your exit. Earlier this week, I heard from an agency owner who had mentioned being stuck at both a revenue and profit plateau for like a decade. That is a
Yeah.
long time. I mean, it's good that things haven't gone down, but they've been a bit stuck and they want to break through that to sell for $10 million. Fortunately, they do have a long enough timeline, like they're looking like 5 to 10 years out to get that turned around. So I think we can fix that. But for people who are listening, whether live or on the video, what is your ideal exit? We talk about that in the Control and Maximize Your Agency Exit training. And if you'd like a free preview from that training, you can get the exit plan template that we share in the training. You can get that free of charge as a preview. If you click the link in chat or in the video description, you can sign up to get access to the exit plan template, as well as my newsletter for agency leaders. If you have any questions on that, feel free to reach out. We're glad to help. So shifting back to answering that beyond the promo of the template, Jonathan, what are concrete steps people can take right now to prepare to sell later?
Can I first comment on your advertisement?
Go ahead.
You mentioned someone who's been stuck at the same revenue for 10 years, profitability for 10 years. My guess is that person needs to get out of their own way. Because if you're stuck at that level, that means that you are the one keeping the team from growing. Um, but that's me being wildly like I'm just guessing. Um, okay, so
It is possible. I will say I had pointed someone to what's now punctuation, over a decade ago, uh, where they were buying out their spouse or they were getting divorced and needed to buy out their spouse. And I think the the summary of the valuation was your agency is worth less than nothing, which I mean made sense because it was not going well.
yeah.
But there was also a comment, maybe you should get a job working for someone else because you don't seem to be competent at running your own business. I
And
mean,
that's what you
part.
pay for when you hire us.
I mean, the thing is, like in writing that, I mean, it was harsh, but David was right on that. Like they were not a good business person.
Yeah. Um,
Right.
so with that, so what are some
Yes.
things that you can do now to
Yes.
help set yourself up for success later when you're selling? One of the kind of easiest things would be to make sure that you are on accrual-based accounting. Every buyer is going to require that you move to accrual in order to value your business. And so you're going to be paying for that regardless. I know it's a little bit more, but you may as well pay for it now instead of at the end when you don't get the benefit of actually making good business decisions because accrual is more helpful to running your business anyway. So move to accrual. Along with that, on the financial side, clean up your P&L and clean up your balance sheet. And on the P&L, make sure you're using cost of goods sold correctly. There's different schools of thought on what that looks like, and I won't, so correctly can be a few different things, let's say. But for us, we like cost of goods sold to be only expenses that are tied directly to a client and that are external to a firm, so that they're truly variable costs. Um, Back to the $800 lease of a BMW or 900. I mean, first of all, that sounds like a great deal in this economy. Uh, but you're on mute, Carl.
That was many years ago, so
Okay.
it would probably be it would be more now.
Okay. Well, I'd say
Yeah.
jump on that deal. No. Um, in general, try to pull out all the personal expenses from the business. I know there are usually some tax implications to running expenses through, but if you are truly considering selling, a buyer's going to see that. And the signal it sends is that you're running a personal lifestyle business, not
Hmm.
a real professionally run, process driven business. And there's just this, once buyers see that, there's just a different way that they approach picking apart your finances and they look at everything with maybe a bigger magnifying glass than they might otherwise. So, if possible, it's easier to just keep personal and business separate.
Makes sense. We got a follow-up question in chat. How many years back do buyers look into cleaning out personal expenses? I mean, you've noted that buyers are
Yeah.
generally looking at 3 years of financials. Um, uh, when would you recommend cleaning up personal expenses?
3 years is what they're going to be looking at, but if you can even show 1 year of clean, no personal expenses, you're going to be on the right track.
Makes
And
sense.
usually that most recent year is going to be weighted more heavily. And so the impact of those personal expenses and add backs will be lessened anyway.
Hmm.
So even a year is really helpful. Um, Pay yourself a market rate would be another thing you can do now. Think about your own pay as your replacement cost because that is what the buyer is going to look at your salary as. So if you are leaving the business, they're gonna say, well, what am I gonna have to pay someone to do the job you're doing?
Yep.
And they're gonna take that amount of money as salary and make sure that it's baked into your P&L for 3 years,
Mm.
looking backwards. And so you may as well get the benefit of paying yourself a market rate now versus just having your profit go down when you get to the end.
So
Um,
ultimately, by paying yourself market rate now, it's not like you're going to save money later or get a better deal later if you underpaid yourself, and you're getting the money today. So just pay yourself market rate now.
yes.
Makes sense. So here's a question. I recently wrote an article about doing acqui-hire exits, where you're basically taking on a job more or less permanently, or at least ongoing with the acquirer, and you're also sending over some or all of your team and your book of business. It looks publicly like an acquisition, but it's going to be at a lower multiple and things like that. The question we have from one of our audience members is wanting to sell a small PR agency, about 1.5 million a year in revenue. The owner wants to retire, but mentions has an amazing staff. What kind of a buyer would want to buy that business?
Well, that sounds like you just answered it. Did you want to add on to
I
your
mean, it sounds like it would be an acqui-hire. Is there anything you would add from your perspective, Jonathan?
yeah, I mean that's not really enough information for uh me to give a really solid answer, but I'll say there are plenty of buyers for smaller businesses. You might have more of an acqui-hire scenario, but you might also have an operator scenario where you're selling to someone who just isn't good at building things, but
Hmm.
knows how to run things of a certain size. And so might want to jump in, learn from you for a little bit, and then actually take over as operator. You also might be able to find, a family office or something that's a little bit more culture driven in terms of their investments, that would really value the people side. But in general, in the professional services space, people is always your biggest asset, and so most buyers are going to value your people. Um, the way that that gets valued just happens to be like your people's ability to generate profit.
Yeah. That makes sense. And by the way, for anyone who is looking to step out faster, you may consider selling to someone running a search fund. I shared a link to the ETA Entrepreneurship Through Acquisition conference, which is in Chicago, co-run by the University of Chicago and Northwestern. And the idea there is these are people who are usually recent MBA graduates, usually from elite programs. They are doing a search for 18 to 24 months that they have angel investors funding for them
Yeah,
to look. And then once they find a business they want to acquire, they'll then bring in some institutional money, whether from a small private equity firm or a bigger private equity firm, to fund buying the business. A key thing there is their goal is to become the CEO immediately or almost immediately. So if you
right.
want to exit, selling to the recent MBA graduate who has the financial backing and wants to become the CEO could be the fastest way for you to step away.
Can I also mention one thing
Yeah, yeah.
now to help prepare yourself is to actually start thinking about evaluation early.
Mm,
Um, And getting evaluation soon has a few benefits. One, it's a great conversation starter if you have other partners. It's also just a good conversation starter for yourself if you're a sole proprietor,
yep.
in terms of goal setting and how realistic is getting to, your goal, really. It's a great planning tool, particularly if you couple it with a forecast, sales forecast. And it doesn't really matter when you get one. You don't have to wait till the end of the year. The way that, most uh, reputable firms, including us, do them now is trailing 12 months. And so you don't have to wait till the end of the year's closed out. Um, and then finally, your firm is likely your biggest individual asset. And if you think about your portfolio of personal assets, you likely have a pretty good sense of what most of them are worth. But if you don't know what your biggest one is worth, that feels like a real gap in terms of just financial planning. So,
A client was recently talking about estimating their net worth, and they forgot to include the value of the agency in the calculation, and that was like a third of their family's net worth.
yeah,
And in fact, bigger than any other single asset they had. I mean, that's true for most of my clients, and I imagine, Jonathan, for a lot of yours as well. Their agency is their family's number one or maybe number two financial asset.
absolutely.
Here's a question about AI. We must talk about AI. A question from Scott. With AI lowering the barriers to entry of starting an agency and running one, is proprietary technology within an agency becoming less valuable to buyers?
Well, I wish I could predict the future. I'm notoriously bad at it, but in general, proprietary technology is only going to be as valuable to buyers as the ability, again, to generate profit. So it's usually not valued separately from the business, and it's assumed that its inherent value is going to be tied up in the same financials that they're looking
Hmm.
at. I would say that doesn't necessarily make it less important. It would be important to include uh, AI, AI-driven thinking in those models, because that might help you increase the at least interest in your company. Um, there are going to be, I think, sectors of the industry that AI hits first, um, including, content and coding dev. Those are the areas that I haven't yet seen multiples decline, but I do foresee that in the future multiples will start to creep down in those areas. And so, depending on the makeup of the services you offer, you might consider shifting focus if an exit is truly in the plans.
That makes sense. I have an article about agency models, and one is the idea of thinking about a front-end agency, a back-end agency, or what agencies have traditionally been a full stack agency. Front end is where you outsource most of the production delivery work to white label or back-end firms, and you're doing the client strategy, the account management, the project management, sales, marketing, and so on. The advantage to that is that if work fluctuates up or down, you're not having to do rapid hiring or rapid layoffs. You're able to adjust thanks to your white label partners. It takes time to find the right back end agency or agencies, but something to consider because in that case, with the growth of AI and other things, your agency could come out ahead because your fulfillment costs are going down, in fact. And you can choose whether to pass that on to clients or perhaps maybe it's the same price but faster turnaround or something like that. Jonathan, a follow-up question. I have heard from agency owners asking, how does AI impact valuations? Have you seen any trends on that yet? I know when we did the workshop, now available on demand, you had noted that, pure AI-focused agencies were holding off on selling because, they figured the numbers would go up. But anything you're noticing right now about impact of AI on valuations and exits?
Yeah, we haven't seen negative impacts yet, but I do expect to see those in the next year to 18 months. And I do think that to the extent you're able to incorporate AI into your business now, the better you'll be able to kind of weather the oncoming storm and prove your worth when it does come time to exit.
Got it. Question about red flags. We've talked about some of this already. what operational or financial red flags would make things harder to sell an agency? You mentioned if the books aren't clean, if there are a lot of personal expenses that are intermixed in the business, if there isn't a lot of recurring revenue, things like that. Anything else you'd add around operational or financial red flags?
Red flags, I think it's going to be a lot of it's going to be founder dependency. And
Mm,
that's why there's this kind of magic number at $1 million in EBITDA, which usually equates to a 4 to 5 million revenue agency, at which the buyer pool just kind of explodes.
mm,
And that's because people assume that if you're able to be that large, you're no longer dependent on the founder.
yep.
Below that, there's a lot more just kind of due diligence that has to be done to parse that out. Um, so one of the one of the other areas that this can show up is in revenue growth. You know, declining revenues, not great. It's fine to have a blip year. Upward revenues at least show that you're thinking about the business in kind of a future-proofing way. Um, your profitability, if you have never hit that 20% level of profitability, that can also be a red flag because buyers might assume that, well, maybe it's not even possible with this agency to run it,
Mm.
super profitably, right? Like maybe you're not serving a profitable enough niche, or the services you're offering aren't valuable to folks. So
And,
being
and
able to
and keep in mind
demonstrate,
that for the buyers, they have plenty of agencies to buy. The seller has one agency to sell.
yeah.
Question about buyers. What types of buyers are buying agencies today?
Um, First of all, am I breaking up? Can you hear me okay?
A little bit, but I'm hearing you okay now.
Okay. So all types. We still have, private equity involved. They're a little bit more focused maybe than they have been in the past. Um, there are holding companies, there are individual investors, there are family offices, there are strategic, larger agencies. There are even like medium-sized agencies that are seeing, oh, I'm on the path to, a $10 million exit, but a faster way there would be to acquire basically that revenue or profit uh, to increase my multiple moving forward. So there's no shortage of types of buyers out there these days, which is great well, it's great and overwhelming for sellers. But throughout the process, you kind of can get a sense for what type of buyer makes the most sense for you.
Got it. We talked a bit about retaining key team members. We have an audience question from Chris. He asks, is there a typical stay bonus percentage that we would recommend for leadership team members?
No. Um, it I mean, and there are different ways to structure it. I counsel people that it's really, you got to craft something for the individual. So there's no
Mm,
blanket percentage. You're going to have a relationship, right, with each individual, and you're going to know what motivates them. Some might be more motivated by growth opportunities, and so you might not need to incentivize them as much with, actual money. Some might be more motivated by a big check up front, and you might have the trust level to say that, okay, now I know they'll stay on. Some might be motivated more by like, points where you're giving them smaller checks in the future.
mm.
So it really is, you need to build something for your specific situation. Um, and you don't need to do it for everyone, only the folks that are truly irreplaceable.
Makes sense. And certainly for people who are in the inner circle, I sometimes have owners who are like, well, I don't know, when should I tell people? If a team member is critical to your having the exit, tell them sooner than later, within reason, but don't keep it a secret from them.
Yeah, and to piggyback on that, just make sure you're framing it in a way that leaves it open for something not to happen. Because a lot of times these
Yes.
deals can fall through. So,
Yep.
we're exploring an opportunity, going down the path. Like this isn't a sure thing. And I will say different people have different levels of ability to hold these two potential truths in their mind at once. It's like
Right.
Schrodinger's cat, right? Like, is the agency going to sell or not? Like, you open the box and then it's sold. I don't know. But um, yeah, you're right.
Speaking of surprises, what surprises agency owners the most when they go through an exit?
Two things. One is the adjustments made to their salary if they are not paying themselves market rate, uh, looking backwards. And the other thing there is that, sometimes we'll see agency owners who come in knowing they're not paying themselves a market rate. They're taking lots of distributions to compensate for that, but then they expect a large market rate salary during the earnout, and you can't have it both ways. You're gonna either take a smaller salary during the earnout because that's what you have been taking, or you'll take kind of the same amount because you've proved that the agency can be profitable without it. The other area is around networking capital. And so we've been talking about, multiples of EBITDA, uh, but that neglects the balance sheet. So the balance sheet is all the cash and accounts receivable that you have, minus all the money that you have to pay out. But this can be a sizable sum. And some folks assume that I can just take all the cash that's in the bank, right? That is not true. You need to have in your mind that you need to leave at least 2 months worth of operating expenses in the business because they're going to not want to have to put money into the business as soon as they buy it.
Yep.
And you also need to make sure that from an accrual perspective, that cash is accounted for correctly. So, yes, it's great if you have the cash on the balance sheet, but you also, if it's prepayments, you need to have a corresponding liability on the balance sheet so that, uh, for work that's not yet done. Um, and so that can really trip up folks and it can affect valuations pretty considerably as well.
And within that, once you've adjusted for working capital, which is negotiable, plus say things related to, upcoming commitments, you could walk away with a fair amount of cash that is not part of the valuation. Like let's say you've got $1 million
Yeah.
in cash in the business, you negotiate keeping 300,000 for the working capital and other commitments, you could take out $700,000 totally unrelated to the valuation. So that's something to keep in mind. Maybe the valuation is lower than you expected, but you're also keeping the excess cash.
Yeah. And then the flip side of that is the alternative is like you could just shut down the business and take all of it out and including that
Yes,
300,000. So you have to do the math on what makes the most sense for you.
that makes sense. And I saw we had a question about owner comp. Claire has shared my article on owner comp ranges. So as we get into the home stretch, a question about negotiation. What is one negotiation mistake you see agency owners make when selling?
Uh, Not hiring me.
Okay, so that's the
No.
first mistake. Although I will say, when I have my articles about selling, like hire professionals. You've got one chance to get this right. Or I mean, you might go through going on the market a couple times, but you have one chance to get the valuation right. You hire someone to help with your taxes. You hire someone to help with financial planning. You might hire a personal trainer. You might hire someone else. Like, don't do it yourself. Talk to someone who's done this before. And importantly, that has signed a contract to put your interests at heart rather than someone where who knows where they're coming from. So, okay, maybe what's the second mistake people
Okay, great.
would
Yeah.
make?
Second mistake would be not sharing enough information early on. And so
Mm,
there's sometimes this idea that I need to keep my cards close to the vest, and that's the only way to get the highest number. but buyers don't want to play around. Like they don't want to play games. So
Mm,
there is also you can share too much early on. So you have to kind of give them enough information to get some directional information on, is this going to be a fit or not? But you don't want to just have these conversations draw out because you are unwilling to share your top line revenue numbers, for example.
makes sense. I mean, it's something of a dating analogy. Don't overshare, don't
Yeah,
undershare.
yeah,
Makes sense. I've written about life after the sale and helping people think through what they want after they exit. Some of that'll depend. Are they doing a life-changing exit where they never have to work again, or they have options? In the Control and Maximize Your Agency Exit workshop, we surveyed the attendees from the live edition, and we asked, what would you ideally be doing after your exit? And about half of the respondents said they would start a new business.
yeah.
Other people have other things in mind. But in your experience, what should agency owners consider about life after selling, financially, professionally, personally?
Um, the type of person that starts an agency, I would say usually is not going to be the type of person that's going to want to sit on the beach with a Mai Tai nonstop. So, like, yes, that sounds great for a week or two,
Hmm.
but you should also be aware that you're probably like, your brain's going to still work and you're going to
Yep,
want to do other things with your mind. Um, Now you're going to be tied up in a, non-solicit, non-compete agreement for your agency. And so if you do start another business, it likely will not be able to be in the marketing space unless you have some kind of unique carve out that you've negotiated prior to that. So it's good to start thinking about these things because if you know that, I'd like to go into a related field, then you need to have that conversation before you sign all the paperwork effectively.
that makes sense. And one more reason to talk to people who've been through this before, advisor-wise, rather than just discovering it the hard way. Uh, final question. This is if someone sort of a pre-selling steps. For agency owners who aren't sure about selling yet, if they want to sell or not, what steps should they take now?
Again, I would point to the valuation.
Yep.
The way that we conduct them, at least, we give you a lot of information about how a buyer would view your firm, how far away you are from a higher multiple. And so it really does empower you to help make good decisions about whether selling is the right road or not. We're working with an owner now, and we went through the valuation, and we came back and said, I don't think you should sell. Like your ability to run this company with 10 hours a week. You've proven that you can do it and you're pulling out, 40% profit margins. Like I think I'm exaggerating, but uh,
They've got a good
so
deal.
yeah, yeah. So
Yep.
we developed a plan for him to grow the agency to a certain point without selling and then basically like strip it for parts at the end because he doesn't want to have anything to
Mm.
do with it in, 3 to 4 years.
And that raises an important point, which is that one person's ideal exit is not everyone's ideal exit. You need to find what's right for you. Uh, all the more reason to get the free exit plan template to start thinking through things, especially if you get an unsolicited offer, right? Not everyone gets unsolicited offers, but if you get an unsolicited offer, ideally you've thought through what is your ideal exit so that if someone pops up and assuming it's legitimate, you could have a further conversation. You want to know what you want rather than just letting the other party drive things. I had a client years ago where they'd gotten a cold offer. It was a legitimate or inquiry, a legitimate inquiry. And he decided pretty quickly that just the culture of the other agency wasn't a match. And he had thought ahead about his exit, and he's able to bow out before getting into, certainly not an LOI and things like that. He was able to bow out sooner than later, and then eventually did sell a couple years after that. Uh, Jonathan, how can people get in touch? I know we've shared links in chat and in the description, but if people haven't been following along, where should they go?
Yeah, you can just email me directly, Jonathan at punctuation.com. And I'll just to put a point on what you were saying, exit planning is something you do have to be proactive about, and it's also not something you can delegate to your team, right? So it's one of
Mm,
the few things that you do need to engage in, and only you. And so I'm glad that you're having talks like this that can, help people at least start the conversation.
awesome. Jonathan, thank you for joining. Appreciate having you as the guest expert again.
Absolutely.
Well, that concludes agency office hours for March 2025. If you have questions you'd like us to answer in future events, please reach out. You can go to sakasandcompany.com/office hours. That'll give you the opt-in sign up area, and you can ask your question when you sign up. We'll let you know in advance if we're going to answer your question, whether live or I'll just answer the question as is. And these videos are available free of charge. Afterwards, if you're watching the video, like or subscribe. And as a preview, our next session coming up in April is a look at my 2030 agency predictions. Where do I see agencies going in 2030 based on my recent article on the topic? And I can answer your questions about applying that to your specific agency. So thank you so much for joining and good luck out there.